What's going on, everybody? Zack Rosenblatt here with the newest episode of the No Huddle Show. I'm here with Mike Kaye. Sorry we haven't been around for a couple weeks. We were, bouncing around Indianapolis, gabbing with some NFL people. Today we've just been distracted by the Game of Thrones trailer. We're both pretty excited about it. But yeah, we just wanted to get back in the mix. There's so much stuff going on. We're going to try and cover all of it. We'll be getting you guys some more podcasts more frequently during the offseason because the Eagles have a lot of stuff going on. But Mike, that was both of our first trip to Indy, right? That was your first one.
Yeah, normally I would cover the Senior Bowl and the Pro Days, and this year we put a priority, obviously, on the Combine with our company, and, I think we got a lot out of it. I mean, there was a lot of whispers that we were able to kind of hear. There were a lot of...
It's pretty much a whispering combine. Like, the actual, stuff going on in the field really doesn't matter to, the people that are in Indianapolis.
Yeah, we were
maybe the scouts, I guess.
If you're a Game of Thrones fan, we were like Varys and Littlefinger, just, chilling around, just hearing all the birds. But,
it was Varys that had, the little kids whisper, getting him all the secrets or whatever, right? Yeah.
Yeah, we should say that no kids were used in the involvement of our sourcing.
Yeah, in Indianapolis, there were no kids running around telling us about Antonio Brown wants to go to the Raiders or something. That's not where
I saw one girl drop a lollipop, but other than that was it. It was an eye-opening experience just because there's so much going on. It's one of those events where, to give you a little bit of insight into other NFL events, the playoffs, you're focused on a game. The owners' meeting, you're very you have a very succinct schedule. The Senior Bowl, same thing. Combine, everything. All of that stuff is very uniform and very well thought out and processed. The Combine, you're just kind of everywhere,
until 3 a.m. too.
Right? Yeah. Oh my gosh, yes. And you see everyone and everybody's around.
That's one of the cool things. There's a couple bars and restaurants that everybody in the NFL hangs out at. And there's one night where Jerry Jones is in the corner. You see Mike Vrabel walking. It's just cool seeing all these faces around town. But as we said, there's a lot to talk about, a lot to take out of the Combine. The Eagles in particular have had a lot of stuff happen, even since we left at least. We're going to go through some of the storylines that are going on with the Eagles right now. We'll do more recent, and then we'll go backwards. The first one that happened most recently, as we're recording this podcast, was the Eagles, as expected, really, are planning to decline Timmy Jernigan's $13 million team option. First of all, it saves them $7 million by doing that, and they take a $6 million dead cap hit, which, if you think about, they signed him to this huge contract, a year and a half ago, and they've already moving on from him, and it's largely because of his mysterious offseason injury, and if he doesn't do that, then he's locked into this contract. It was pretty guaranteed, I believe, and he was willing to do that because it was a non-football injury. I think they valued Timmy Jernigan on this team, I think, not at $13 million. He's a really well-liked guy in the locker room. He's pretty good when he's healthy. A back injury is a concern, so it doesn't shock me that they're letting him go. But, I wouldn't be surprised here if they brought him back on a cheap deal. But as it stands right now, he won't be on this team.
Yeah, I think he's in a weird spot, right? Because you look at the defensive line draft class, and there's a lot of really good defensive tackles. And so I don't know how much teams are really going to spend on interior pass rushers.
Especially guys that don't really get sacks, since he doesn't really get sacks.
Right.
He's more of a run stopper kind of guy.
Right, and I think, he's a guy that might need to sign later in March.
In one of those prove-it deals.
Yeah, and if you're him, you probably want that prove-it deal to be in Philadelphia, I would think. You've got to see what happens with their free agency and everything like that, but I think, Jim Schwartz just is emphatic with his praise about Jernigan. I think Peterson really appreciates his energy. So it's a decision that probably will need to wait a little while before they retain him. That said, it's the right thing to do. Opening up $7 million could really help you, especially if a lot of the rumors are true about trade interest and free agent interest. But on top of that, extending your own guys, which I think has been the theme of this week.
Yeah, well, before we get into that, I should say, if they do move on from Tim Jernigan, you mentioned this, there's a lot of options to replace him. And I think if they don't bring him back, I kind of get the sense that what they would do is draft somebody either in the first or second round, and you bring in a veteran type of guy. ideally an upgrade from a Haloti Ngata. You know, Bo Allen was an ideal guy for that. They should have brought him back anyway. We've talked about that plenty on here, even dating back to when Elliott was still on the podcast. We couldn't believe that they chose Haloti Ngata over Bo Allen. But the Buccaneers might release him. You know, there's another familiar face. Benny Logan would be okay as a backup. There's some other like intriguing like veteran guys they could sign, or they could go and try and sign somebody to start. You know, there's some like if they wanted to spend on Sheldon Richardson or somebody like that, they're more likely to do a veteran and rookie. There are some really good rookie guys. I mean, defensive tackles the top ones looked really good in Indianapolis, especially Dexter Lawrence. Dude's 340 pounds. I think he ran less than a 5.
No, he ran a 5.
I mean, considering that size, that's really good.
Yeah, that's ridiculous.
And he put up really good bench press numbers. I mean, there's guys like Ed Oliver. There's Christian Wilkins might be there at 25 at this point. He didn't have a great combine, but I think they like him. I believe they visited with him out there.
They did.
So I wouldn't be surprised if I wasn't before they re-signed Brandon Graham, which we're going to get into in a minute. I wasn't sure they would draft a defensive tackle that early because you prioritize edge rushers over defensive tackles in this league because there's not enough. When you have the chance to get guys like that, you go and get them. They still could draft an edge rusher in the first round, by the way, for reasons we'll talk about later in the podcast. But at this point, if I was predicting right now, I would say they're going to draft a defensive tackle in the first round.
Defensive tackle is easily their biggest need. Is it going to be the best position on the board? That's what I think.
Well, that's how Howie approaches it.
Right. I think you look at. I think when you look at it just objectively, I think defensive tackle, wide receiver, and safety are their biggest needs now with the Brandon Graham news. You want to get into that?
Yeah. So, first of all, while we were in Indianapolis, Howie Roseman and Doug Peterson spoke to us on Wednesday, and one of the things that Howie emphasized that they prioritize keeping their talented players in the building, and then you augment that with other players. So they prefer to spend their money on, and Howie's done that the last couple of years. Last time they really went on a spending spree, I just did air quotes. I forgot you can't really see that on a podcast. There's no video here, is there? No, there's not. But the last time they really spent like a bunch of money on free agents was the year they brought in Brandon Brooks. Who's the other big free agent they brought in that year? I'm blanking. It was a couple years ago.
Rodney McLeod.
Rodney McLeod. Those were the two big ones that year. They spent a decent amount of money on those guys.
2016.
They were in their late 20s, so you're investing in a guy in their prime. And I imagine that, and how even reference, I'm only going to sign guys. We prefer to go after the guys that are like in the middle tier of free agency, not like the elite guys where you're competing against every team in the league. The mid tier you're competing with against 6 or 7 teams. Anyway, the point being, they prefer to keep their guys in house that deserve to be here. And I think you and I were both a little surprised that they did wind up actually re-signing Brandon Graham, and as early as they did, he didn't have to re-sign 2 weeks before the free agency started. I think he gave them a discount. To be honest, he's going to be making around $13 million a year for 3 years. $40 million over 3 years was the contract. We don't know like all the guaranteed and all the figures and stuff, but based on the way all these defensive ends are getting franchise tagged, D Ford, Jadeveon Clowney, DeMarcus Lawrence, Frank Clark, those are all the top free agent defensive ends. So that would have left pretty much Trey Flowers and Brandon Graham in free agency, and I think he would have gotten at least $15 million per year.
Yeah, I think that it's more about the devil you know than the devil you don't know, and I think when you look at this defensive end class, it's deep, but you're so infatuated with the rotation that you're going to need a veteran and a rookie, or a veteran and another veteran, to make up for the possible depth you're going to lose. We'll get into it a little bit later, but Michael Bennett could be on the trade block. Chris Long could retire or move on. You need to solidify that group, and I think Brandon Graham's a guy who delivers as a pass rusher and a run stopper, and that's what Jim Schwartz really covets. So I think it makes sense to lock him up long term. He was talking like he didn't know if he'd be back, but he was still doing the PR tour that, hey, I want to be here and everything like that. He's probably the most unusual career Eagle of the last several years. I mean, Brent Selleck was a guy that everybody kind of figured this was his spot, and then Brandon Graham's been through turmoil. He didn't start for his first 5 years. This is kind of a crazy story, and I think Brandon Graham will benefit this team next year because he's not coming off ankle surgery. He's 100% healthy. He played very well in the playoffs. He's a guy that they want to build around. Fletcher Cox, Malcolm Jenkins, and whatever cornerback they like this week. So I think he's a foundational piece, and it's good for him that he'll be here for another few years.
I said this throughout the season of the podcast. He would say things that was like, it made it almost obvious that he was leaving. And his last day on cleanout day, I think he thought he was not going to be with the Eagles anymore. He hugged every single media member on their way out of the door. Like, you don't do that if you expect to come back. So it's cool. It's a surprise, but it's cool. You know, he's one of the most well-liked guys in the locker room. I know he started off his career, like you said, everybody called him a bust, but I think this was a big move for the Eagles. They weren't going to get a guy better than him, is the reality. They weren't going to get Frank Clark. They weren't going to get any of those franchise-tag guys. Maybe Trey Flowers would have been a guy that's better than him, but he also is going to cost a lot of money, I think. So that was a good move. And now, you know, they also looked internally, like I said, you know, Graham was going to be a free agent. They looked at 2 offensive linemen, and they extended them. The more important one, obviously, is Jason Kelce, who had been considering retirement. I don't know if he was actually considering it, but I think he probably wanted this raise pretty badly, and he deserves to be the highest paid center in the NFL, which he will be now. I believe the number, he'll be making $11 million per year.
He's the highest paid center per average.
Per average, yeah.
Two-time All-Pro.
You know, you talk about crazy trajectory. Even Kelce, you know, in 2016, he was graded the worst starting center in the NFL, I believe. They were going to trade him or cut him. Like, that was the talk, and then they decided to stick with him. The last 2 years, he's been graded the number 1 center in the NFL by Pro Football Focus. He's been an All-Pro both years. Last year, he battled a knee injury all year, which, you know, wasn't talked about for a lot of the year. And that, I mean, it's been brought up more often now, but you just had, I mean, this is the kind of guy you can't afford to let be upset. He's the most popular guy in Philadelphia, like, now that Nick Foles is gone.
Yeah, and I think him probably finishing his career here, which he was going to probably do anyway if he would have retired, but extending that career is important, especially when you consider all the turmoil that's kind of around the offensive line right now. Jason Peters continues to age. He's got a history of injury problems.
Brooks' injury. Yeah.
He's got a huge contract. You got the Brooks injury. You know, Lane Johnson's 1 suspension away from,
year.
Yeah, so there's a lot going on there. Isaac Seumalo's been okay, but he's been okay. You know what I mean? So locking down the center of the offense and a guy that Carson Wentz really likes working with is a smart move. This offseason needs to be about making Carson Wentz comfortable, and Jason Kelce sticking around is a big part of that.
Yeah, and, you know, it's interesting because he's, 31, right? And between him and Brandon Graham, they're both 31, I believe. And the Eagles historically just usually moved on from guys as they hit that age. But the interesting part about both of those guys, they're pretty unique, which I feel like is an underrated part of this because, as you mentioned, Brandon Graham, the first half of his career, he both didn't start and he wasn't very productive. And I think you're seeing him come into his stride the last 3 years. And then Kelce has had the best 2 years of his career the last 2 years. So it's like, yes, by the end of their contracts, maybe you'll see them on decline, but it's 3 years for both of them, I believe. They're both going to expire in 2021. So I don't have any issue with them doing what they did. Those guys deserve to get the money they make. One that was, I don't know if surprising, but they did extend Isaac Seumalo. You messaged him, and that was just a clear sign that they're expressing their confidence in him as a core part of this offensive line, which is, a year ago we were talking about him as a training camp bubble guy. Mm-hmm. He was one of the bigger surprises of the season. I know you said he was okay, but okay is a pretty big step up from what he was the year before when he lost his job to Wiz. What this means going forward, you know, they view him as the future. I think whenever Kelce retires, he might be the guy they slide over to replace Kelce. Mm-hmm. I'm more curious about what this means for Stefan Wisniewski, and I think a lot of that has to do with, number one, if they're confident Brandon Brooks is going to be back by the start of the season, which I'm not confident he will be. And number two, if they would rather keep Wisniewski or pursue a rookie and or another veteran guy as opposed to keeping a guy who pretty clearly is unhappy not starting. He's pretty much expressed that publicly.
You said, what does this mean for Stefan Wisniewski? As a league source told me, probably not anything good.
Yeah, I mean, obviously. If they're prioritizing Seumalo over him, I mean.
And you can cut him for $3 million, and they need all the salary cap space they can get.
Especially, you know, if Jason Peters comes back, that might be the end for Wisniewski because they need that extra money.
And then you drafted Matt Pryor, you drafted Jordan Mailata, you have Big V. You're probably going to draft a couple of kids. You can sign a Stefan
Wisniewski-like player for $4 million.
And I think he's served his purpose. I think he's been a very decent utility guard for them. He's, his real strength is that he can play guard and center. I actually covered him in Jacksonville when he had some snapping issues, which then led to him moving to guard.
He's a strange guy, by the way.
Yeah, very interesting. I'm a big fan. You bring up Isaac Seumalo and you bring up Jason Kelce, I'm like a big fan of looking at an entire draft class haul as one entity. And so, like, 5 years after that draft, it doesn't matter if you were a first-round pick, a third-round pick, whatever, that determines the value if you got players. And you look at the 2011 NFL draft. That's the draft where they missed on Danny Watkins, Jaquan Jarrett, Curtis Marsh. I mean, Casey Matthews had a nice 4-year career.
It probably was the draft that did Andy Reid in, honestly.
Right, yeah. Alex Henry. But on here, you have Dion Lewis, who's carved out a nice career and made some money.
Just not in Philadelphia.
Right. What do you mean? He landed Emmanuel Acho in a player-for-player
trade. That's right. They traded with the Browns, right? Wasn't that?
Yeah. So Jason Kelce, I mean, if you told me, and I was a guy that, let's say I was a Cardinals fan, and I was just talking to you about your offensive line, if you would have told me Jason Kelce was a first-round pick for this team back in 2011, I'd say, oh, wow. Okay, that makes sense. You know what I mean? So I think it's a good practice to have. Like, 2010, so that's the year that they, I believe, drafted Brandon Graham.
Yeah.
Yeah, so looking at
the time, it was like, why didn't you draft Earl Thomas, who's actually a free agent this offseason also?
Right, who wants crazy money.
Yeah.
But you look at that, and you see Nate Allen, who not a lot of people liked, but he got a few more contracts. Clay Harbor, who got another contract. Riley Cooper, sorry, I brought him up. And then Kurt Coleman, who's still going strong. So looking at those drafts, it's very interesting to me. But when we talk about, I'm sorry, I'll wrap up and make this point. Isaac Seumalo was the first guy drafted after Carson Wentz. And I think that gets kind of lost in the shuffle.
That third-round pick.
Yeah. They traded a lot to get Carson. Then they prioritized the offensive line for the long term. It was Seumalo and Big V. And Seumalo, if he develops, you can say that draft class is pretty good. I mean, you've got a swing tackle who played left tackle during the Super Bowl run. You got a franchise quarterback. And then you potentially have a foundational guard. I think that's what the re-signing really triggers in my brain is, hey, maybe that draft wasn't just Carson.
All right, and then we can flip it back to the other side of the guy that won't be coming back to Philadelphia, which, as expected, is Nick Foles. Howie Roseman kind of surprisingly told us at the Combine that they're not going to franchise tag Foles, which was pretty much a week before they had to do that. A lot of people are talking about like they're doing it out of courtesy to him, but the reality is there's nobody who was going to trade for him. Like even the Jaguars, who it seems like a foregone conclusion he's going there. I'd say that's a little premature considering there's still another week until more than a week till free agency. And, if Josh Rosen's in the mix, who knows what the Jaguars want to do, blah, blah, blah. But there was no teams that, we don't need to rehash this whole discussion, but there wasn't enough teams that were interested for the franchise tag to be a realistic thing. But it's good for Foles. He gets a chance to go out in the open market and become a starting quarterback somewhere. Probably the Jaguars. I would guess he makes somewhere in the range of $18 million a year, I would guess. I don't think he's going to make 20. Unless like the Dolphins or Redskins like, wait, maybe we should consider Nick Foles instead of Ryan Tannehill or some of these other scrubs they're talking about. So
I would expect his market to be around 16 to 19 million. Yeah. I think that's like a fair range.
I think in the story I wrote, I projected 3 for 57.
Yeah, that's a pretty good one. I would have said 3 for 55.
Yeah. That $2 million.
Yeah, hey, it's all about the funny money. But yeah, I think Nick, I wrote this today. Obviously, we've talked about it before. I covered the Jaguars prior to coming here. I think, prior to, and I've been on this podcast and said I didn't think it was a great fit, but that was when the franchise tag was taken into consideration. I think, oh, wow. Sorry, my ADD. As we're talking right now, the Texans have released cornerback Kevin Johnson, who's a former first-round pick. Don't ask about him. No. Hardcore pass. Back to Nick Foles. So I think Nick Foles is a guy who actually fits into the Jaguars organization pretty well from a personality standpoint, from a quarterback standpoint, from a leadership standpoint. My big hang-up was money. Like you said, I don't think his market's going to be very good, which is going to bring down his market value, which means they're going to be able to get him for less than market value. On top of that, they don't have to trade away a pick. That is huge because, as we know, Nick Foles needs stuff built around him, and now with the lack of a market and the lack of trading away assets, the Jaguars can build around him, and I think that makes him way more intriguing as an option for the Jaguars.
Yeah, because now their offense needs a lot of work, especially if Foles is their quarterback. So, and they have the number 7 pick. They have high second-round pick. They have multiple third-round picks, I believe.
Yeah, the Dante Fowler.
They don't have cap space right now, but they can clear out a bunch of guys and get there, which they would have to do to sign Foles anyway. But all right, now let's talk about 2 guys. One rumored to be coming in, another rumored to be going out. Which one do you want to talk about first?
I'll leave it up to you.
Great decision-making prowess there. All right, we'll talk about the Eagles. So, Michael Bennett, there was a rumor that at the Combine, the Eagles were floating the possibility of trading him. From what I heard, it sounds like that's a real possibility that he's not a part of the team this next year.
Mm-hmm.
On the surface, it's pretty surprising because of how good he was for them last year. You know, you and I raved about him for 8 weeks. He had 9 sacks. He was their second best pass rusher outside of Fletcher Cox. He clearly has not lost a step. He seemed like he was fitting in pretty well in the locker room, especially when we're around the guys. Like, at least among his teammates, he seemed like he was fitting in pretty well. There were some like early season spats where he got into a yelling match with Chris Wilson, and he was kind of doing his own thing when it came to like the anthem and stuff like that. But it seemed like everybody didn't think that was that big of a deal. But they brought back Brandon Graham, which kind of signaled the end for either him or Chris Long, I think, because both of those guys have publicly expressed that they want to have a full-time role. Mm-hmm. And both of them weren't going to have that last year until Derek Barnett got hurt. So all of a sudden, Michael Bennett's a starter, Chris Long's the number 3, and they're getting as many snaps as they would get on any team. Now that you have Barnett back, you have Brandon Graham coming back, and then you have one of Long or him, and if they draft somebody or they feel like Josh Sweat is ready to take the next step, Michael Bennett was not going to have the same role this year. As good as he was last year, he's just not going to. So the reason why you maybe choose to get rid of him over Chris Long, $7 million, non-guaranteed. You get rid of him, you clear $7 million. You save, I believe, like $4 or $5 million if you get rid of Chris Long, and you incur a small cap penalty. So, I mean, it's surprising, but in the grand scheme of things, it makes some sense, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I think
it's not great practice to get rid of great players, I would say, but
right. But he had a good year, and I think he's a tradable asset.
Yeah, exactly, and he'd get you more than like Chris Long would in a trade,
right? And I saw a lot of people debating online whether you would rather sign Brandon Graham or just keep Michael Bennett, and I think those are two completely unrelated.
Yeah.
Subjects. I mean, Brandon Graham, you're not going to get any value for on the trade. You can't trade him.
And he's 4 years younger, too.
Right, and I think he does much better against the run, and that's something that they emphasize heavily in Jim Schwartz's defense. I think Mike Bennett is a good player, but I think they want to get younger. They realize they have to build a sustainable product. I'm not going to talk about the personality stuff because I don't really think that's... Not that it's not relevant, but it's not... When you're looking at value for value, if you said they got him for a 5th-round pick in Marcus Johnson, if they can get a 4th for him, that's a pretty good trade.
Yeah, you got 9 sacks and a 4th-round pick, yeah.
Right. So, I get it. And, the Combine, everybody floats names.
Yeah, that's the thing. Like, just talking about a guy doesn't mean you're necessarily going to trade him.
Right, and I think that
if they do, it will be within the next week, I would guess.
Yeah, I would assume so. And I think for the Eagles, too, they could probably see an opening in this market because you're going to see all these guys get franchise tagged. So
who are you going to get when those guys are out off the table, yeah.
Well, and I think teams are also...
other teams, I'm saying, yeah.
Right, I also think teams are weary of... they're leery of losing compensatory picks. So
you don't lose them in a trade,
right? So I think that's kind of where I would go with that. I think a team like the Rams maybe or the Chargers, you got to send him to a good locker room and a place where he wants to be. But I think he's a good enough player where he can be a starting defensive end in this league.
Yeah, absolutely. And on the guy potentially coming in, the Browns for some reason signed Kareem Hunt this offseason, and they have.
Nick Chubb,
who's really good,
yeah.
And so Duke Johnson has been. It seemed like he was a heavy topic of discussion in Indianapolis. Why do you think he would be a good fit with the Eagles? So
he is a triple threat, like a true triple threat, like Darren Sproles in his prime. They're different. They're a little bit different body types.
Yeah, he's a little bigger. Yeah,
right. But he can run well. He averages over 4 yards per carry. He's a really good receiver out of the backfield. They lined him up in the slot a ton in his early career in Cleveland. And then he's also a really understated blocker. Like, I think he's probably one of the better third down backs in the league. That said, could he have a bigger role? Potentially. He was really good at Miami. And I think, he was one of the few guys that really fit in well with Hugh Jackson. Probably not so much with Kitchens. I had heard that he was on the block and that the Eagles were somewhat interested. That said, he makes a lot of sense for this West Coast offense, especially if you're moving on from Darren Sproles. Do you want another repeat of potential prolonged soft tissue injury, which older guys tend to get? Or do you want to go out and bring in a guy who's signed until 2021 and who can be a long-term piece for this team? I think Duke makes a lot of sense. They have 2 fourth-round picks because of the compensatory pick one of the 2 compensatory picks that they got. I would trade a 4th-round pick for him right now. Like, right now. Would not be a problem, wouldn't blink. That said, you're not going to trade a 2nd-round pick for him, even though they have 2. I could see a player-for-player trade that I would actually really like to propose to you.
Oh, you're proposing to me?
Yeah, I'm going to propose.
You're proposing?
Yeah, so...
I'm just so unexpected.
Let me ask you this.
No, I will not marry you, sorry.
The other guy that there have been some rumblings about is Nelson Aguilar. He's got a $9.4 million contract.
Yeah, see where you're going.
The Browns have a boatload of money.
They could use another receiver.
They could use another receiver, especially a guy who can play on the inside and outside. There's not really a ton around Baker Mayfield. To me, it's a little bit of a cap charge, but you have the money and you can probably rework a nice deal. Do you trade Nelson Aguilar straight up for Duke Johnson?
I think from the Eagles' perspective, I would. I think the Browns need more of like a big-bodied, like tall wide receiver to add to that core that they have. But Aguilar is really good.
But remember, they're not giving up a pick.
Yeah.
So they still could do that.
Yeah, that's fair. I guess from the Eagles' perspective, it would come down to whether they would rather bring in a running back that they know like what kind of player he is, or would you rather have a 4th-round pick for Aguilar that you can decide what that player is. So it makes sense.
I wouldn't trade Aguilar for a 4th-round pick, if that makes sense. See, that's why I think this makes more sense.
Like you're saying that's not enough?
Yeah, I would want a 3rd-round pick for a former 1st-round pick who just had 2 800-yard seasons.
700-yard seasons. He hasn't had 800 yards in his career.
Sorry.
He's not getting a 3rd-round pick in a trade.
I know, but that's why I think the alternative with Aguilar
problem also is a salary, too, in a trade. But
right. My thing is, you've got to get something of value. He is part of your offensive ecosystem and a really big part.
And you have to be sure you can replace him with somebody who's at least as good.
My thing, too, is I think you have to invest a high draft pick in a running back as well. So the fact that you're trading a player for a player, you're not putting more draft capital into him. I just think, to me, Nelson Aguilar is a guy that you trade for another starter in another position. I don't necessarily need a draft pick. You have 8 picks right now. You want a 3rd-round pick. Well, so maybe you do Nelson Aguilar in one of the 4th-round picks and move up in the 3rd. If it's a really early 3rd.
That's kind of Howie type deal. It's kind of like the reverse of what they did in the Jernigan trade.
Right. I think but I think with Jernigan too, Jernigan was a guy that they did not want to get less than the 3rd for, so they settled for a swap value. For me, Duke Johnson for Nelson Aguilar makes a lot of sense because they're both really heavily invested in the offensive ecosystems of both teams.
And the Browns have like $1 billion in cap space.
Right. And I think you can make Aguilar happy with a guy like Baker. Kitchens is a really smart guy. And really, I don't know how... something's got to give with Nelson Aguilar because he's not... he shouldn't be making $9.4 million.
He's not. It's either going to be an extension, they're going to cut him, or they're going to trade him.
I don't see them cutting him.
I think I'm just saying that's one of the 3 avenues that could happen. If they don't find a trade before March 13th, they might have to cut him.
So I'll make a bold prediction. I think that they will find a trade partner for him. That's not a report. It's just I think that's the smart move. Because eventually you're going to get into a thing with him where, you don't really... they still, I don't think, have figured him out, if that makes sense. Like, yeah, he really rose to prominence in the slot, and he's a talented player, but I just don't know if he's ever going to be that number 1 guy. You've already got Alshon. We constantly talk about how they need another guy on the outside. where's the money going? And I think Nelson Aguilar's a guy that you swap for another starter at another position, running back and wide receiver. For both teams are probably of similar value. I think Duke Johnson would be an absolute awesome addition to this team.
Yeah, and he fits well as like a pass catching option. All right, before we get out of here, let's talk a little bit about the NFL Combine, because we were just there, and the Eagles have a lot of picks, a lot of needs. Just real quick, let's go through who are a couple guys you left there thinking like, he would be cool as an Eagles draft pick.
So Miles Boykin from Notre Dame had an unreal combine. I think he was the top in vertical and broad jumps. He was one of the top guys in the 40. He's a guy that doesn't really have a lot of film out there. He's kind of a one-year wonder.
Really good size for that speed, too.
Yeah, really good size.
6'4" or something.
Yeah, 6'4" and 210, 215. He's a guy that I think you could develop long-term. He's probably like a third-round pick or a fourth-round pick, but I think he could be like a valued guy. Alex Barnes from Kansas State, really solid runner, has the ability to catch the football. I think he would be a very good short yardage back. And I think he'd be another option on day 2 or early day 3. The guy I was absolutely blown away by was Montez Sweat.
Yeah.
Like, there's no way.
Well, to the point he's not going to be there at 25 anymore, yeah.
Right. I mean, he was incredible. You looked at
4.42?
Yeah, that's nuts.
He's like 6'7", like 260. Like,
yeah, that's
unreal.
Yeah, so, I mean, and he had a sub 7'1" three cone.
It wasn't like where it's only the 40-yard dash. It was the other stuff too. But okay, you got your 3 guys. So sticking with speedy receivers, at this point he might have jumped out of the Eagles' range, but I would say Paris Campbell, Ohio State. He ran like a 4.3 something, and oh wow. So we'll cut through this for a second because the Eagles just restructured Lane Johnson's contract. That should save them a decent amount of money, actually. And so I believe after all their moves they've done recently, they were depending on like what Brandon Graham's total is and what Jason Kelce's total is, I think they were like 10 million or like 8 million over the cap or something like that. And I believe restructuring Lane Johnson should save them around like $7 million more dollars. So they should be like right at the cap right now. They'll have to do something else, and they'll make a decision on Jason Peters. But this is kind of how he's forte.
Yeah, I mean, and remember, it's a restructure, but that also kind of helps them. You get a bonus up front. There's maybe some more guaranteed money. Lane Johnson was a guy that I was a little concerned about moving forward just because from a money standpoint, it is a big contract. And so you've got to figure out how you're going to work that in, especially with the next couple of years with Carson Wentz getting a massive extension eventually. So overall, I think that, hey, restructure who you want, but you're going to pay for it down the road.
All right, since we're on that back on the Eagles topic, let's look ahead to end the podcast. What do you, coming out of the Combine, with all the things happening, what do you think is the next move the Eagles make?
I think it's the Aguilar situation. I think they have to look for a trade market for him, establish a trade market for him, and get value for him.
I say we find out what Jason Peters is thinking next.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, it's got to come soon.
Yeah, it has to come before the 13th, right?
Right, yeah.
All right. So we'll end on that note. Thanks for listening. Hopefully the sound quality was better in the past. We got some new mics. Leave us some comments, and we'll read them on the next episode. And thanks for listening, guys.